At the time of this recording, it's been almost exactly 1 year since Breath of the Wild's sequel, or Breath of the Wild 2 as we colloquially call it, was revealed at E3 2019 on June 11th. And we've seen neither hide nor hair of it since. But as Breath of the Wild is my favorite game of all time, I'm unsurprisingly excited for the sequel through its promise of similarities, but the hope for some differences too. Let's talk about it. So there are 5 big changes I'd like to see made in Breath of the Wild 2, as well as some honorable mentions I'll throw in at the top. But I should quickly say, if you enjoy this video and want to see more like it, then you should hit the subscribe button and you can see more videos like this on Zelda and all sorts of other Nintendo stuff every Tuesday and Thursday every week. And plugs all out of the way, let's get into it. First, there are a number of conversations and complaints that were leveled around the original game that have the fanbase divided on most of them, and since I'd rather talk about new things I'd like to see, I won't spend all day on these, but here are my quick opinions on the most common complaints and how I'd like to see them addressed in this new game before hitting the real highlights. Enemy variants. This is something I didn't really feel while I was playing the game, but it's true that there are quite limited variety when it comes to enemy. The plus side of this right now is that each of their AIs are incredibly intricate and they all feel real and reactive for the first time. I'd love to see new ones added, but the old ones remain, with just small tweaks to keep us on our toes. They could add in Dodongos, Wolfos, Wallmasters, and there's a whole litany of other options. Item degradation. This is a more contentious topic, but I stand by enjoying the weapon breaking system's existence, but it could be vastly improved upon. As many have said, I think crafting and repairing is one of the main solutions, but I wonder if it might be better as a later game mechanic. So in the same way that you unlock the Champion's Tunic, which is the first time you could see a numerical representation of the enemy's health, you could eventually unlock the ability to see your weapon's exact degradation and repair it or craft it into something new at that point. Shrines versus dungeons. Once again, a divisive issue on which I take a bit of a middle road. I think the open-ended and physics-based nature of Breath of the Wild puzzles meant that they were best suited for shrines as more confined obstacles. So if you could find a way to cheese a shrine, that's 1 out of 120 rather than 1 out of 8 if it were a dungeon. But I also love and miss the traditional dungeons. We may even need to have our resources artificially limited in a true dungeon, just like you couldn't use Rivali's Gale in shrines before. And truthfully, the dungeons need to be a lot larger and most importantly more themed than they were in the first one. Because the Divine Beasts were really cool, but were largely repetitive and didn't really create their own unique memories. I have lots more to say on that, but I'm gonna table it for now. Lack of story. This is a very common criticism for Breath of the Wild. It's partly to do with its open world game design, but that doesn't mean there couldn't be ways to overcome this still. But this one, we're actually going to touch on in one of the main 5 changes, so you know what? Hold on tight, we'll get to that, and speaking of, let's get going with number 1. Magic. Breath of the Wild's story revolved quite largely around the Sheikah and the technology they created that's foreign to most of Hyrule, but Link wields it and Ganon possesses it. Most of Link's abilities in a gameplay sense are based around this technology, or his physical abilities. He's also just a strong dude who gets cool weapons and armor and stuff. But his bombs, his magnesis, his cryonis, and stasis are all sourced out of his Sheikah slate. So that's all his powers, except those granted by the spirits of the Lost Champions, his former allies. Revivification, lightning, protection, and mad hops are all sourced from the spirits of the fallen champions. And their aesthetics look entirely different in-game than the Sheikah powers, and in the trailer for Breath of the Wild 2, we see this scene where Link seems to absorb some kind of magic or spirit power into his hand. And although we know little about it, as it's his right hand and he's left-handed where he holds his sword, I suspect that he'll have new abilities that are magic or spirit-based as a result on his offhand. The tricky thing with this is I think these will replace, or better yet, complement the existing Sheikah slate powers. I imagine some of those will carry over into Breath of the Wild 2. So as far as the gameplay goes, these additional abilities will need to slot in to the physics engine and world of Breath of the Wild, which is pretty complicated. Everything affects everything else. Think about bombs and stasis and cryonis and all that. And since the original gameplay showed off at some events back in the day, anyway had a magic meter, there's a good chance that this was in the works at some time and could come back now. But in a story sense, as we see Ganondorf seem to rise from the dead, we presumably know that it is in fact the technology of the Sheikah that's failed at its job to fully restrain him. So to overcome this evil, Link must grow past just the usage of technology into that of magic as a complementary force. And who is already good with magic? Zelda. Unfortunately, I'm not the first to this topic either, but I've thought it from the beginning and it has to be said. Zelda is obviously a traveling companion during at least part of this game. Otherwise, the initial trailer is a huge misdirect towards a flashback or something similarly disingenuous. But to me, it would be a huge waste of an opportunity to not make Zelda playable in some way. They've even stated that they considered it for Breath of the Wild. To me, the goal would be a Luigi's Mansion 3 style co-op system. There's obviously a part in the trailer where Zelda and Link are separated, and it would be way more boring for that to mean that we're spending the whole game finding her, compared to having to play a section as her, finding her way back to the surface with her completely different skill set. All in all, I'd like for Zelda and Link to be traveling companions in this game for the first time really in Zelda history, and ideally also both be playable. But truthfully, I think this is also the best way to tell a good story throughout the entire game. So much of the story in the first game was already through cutscenes with Zelda, but as flashbacks, which made all of the imminent tasks feel a lot less pressing. And those cutscenes were great backstory to understand, but didn't add a ton of depth to the current events we were actually playing through. But if there were locations that would just trigger a cutscene between Zelda and Link, or with townspeople or enemies, this would make the whole story feel a lot more present and impactful in my opinion. We were hoping for this with the DLC, but that didn't happen at the time, at least. But before the DLC, we also hoped for time travel. This all depends on what the game is like in the first place. Is this really a story sequel or a story prequel somehow? We've got to assume a sequel based on the context clues, but we could have also just been misdirected so far as we all know. But a mechanic I would love to see is the return of some kind of time travel, similar to dungeons in some other games or the entirety of Ocarina of Time. But I think back to the Temple of Time in Twilight Princess, where you enter a broken down temple and suddenly you're able to travel back in time there, and there's a whole dungeon just for this one location. When I entered into the broken down Temple of Time in Breath of the Wild, I hoped for the same thing, at least eventually, but unfortunately it was just a shell of a former landmark, albeit beautiful and significant. The thing that makes me hopeful about this is that somewhere they talked about the fact that the sequel would take place in the same Hyrule, and I can't imagine us trekking through the same world again and it'd be exciting without including some kind of gameplay gimmick like a Link to the Worlds, for example. For what it's worth, if this is the same Hyrule, I'd like to have some locations fleshed out in general and feel like there were secrets that we just couldn't uncover last time because we didn't have the abilities to, but now that we're returning back to them with these new abilities, everything's opening up. I actually meant to include a whole section on underwater exploration and reintroducing diving back into Zelda, but I forgot to add it until after the fact and already had 5 others. But imagine if you went back to Lake Hylia from Breath of the Wild and there's a whole underground civilization right there. And while they're busy fleshing out these areas, I hope they populate them with the Minish. Honestly, I'd love for them to add a bunch more races across Hyrule, just like we'd like more enemy variants. But we know from Nintendo themselves that they were working on putting the Minish in the original game and just didn't for whatever reason. And I'm hoping the reason they didn't was because they had too many ideas and saved them for later, because there are so many cool things you could do with the Minish, even in a game that's not based around them like the Minish Cap. If Link and Zelda could shrink down to Minish size, even at specific locations, there could be small Minish settlements across all of Hyrule, and each could provide some kinds of side quests that would be the gameplay of Zelda crossed with Pikmin, where what would be a tiny obstacle when full grown becomes a big task as a small little ant person. Honestly, this wouldn't be a make it or break it for the game, but it would be another feather in its cap of ingenuity if they pulled it off right. But then for the 5th and final point, this really could be what seals its fate as the greatest game of all time if everything before it turns out well, and it is the ending. It probably seems like a given that a game should have a good ending, but to be perfectly honest, that's anything but a given for a Zelda game. This has been such an issue to me that in the past, some of my friends and I refer to game endings as whether they have a Zelda ending or not. First, to provide contrast, let's take Pokemon Blue, my first video game ever in 1998 as a 7-year-old. You play the game, you collect Mons, you battle your way up until you beat the Elite Four, and you finally defeat your rival. Credits roll, and you wake up in your mom's house feeling like you've accomplished your task. But you could still travel the world some more if you want. By contrast, in Breath of the Wild, you finally reach Ganon, you punch his face in a fairly good battle that should put your skills to the test, do a second wave of a fight where you shoot some arrows for a while, save Zelda, talk to her in an epilogue scene, and credits roll, and everyone's happy. And then you reload your save, and you're right back at Ganon's castle again, as if none of it had ever happened. The thing is, a bunch of my friends went to go fight Ganon before they finished all the stuff they wanted to do or collect or whatever. They figured that once they defeated Ganon, they could just come back and do all that stuff later, but it turns out the only thing that was defeated was their spirits. We called it the post-Ganon blues or something, and it was the exact reason that I made sure to do all of the stuff in the world before fighting Ganon, even though Zelda's telling you to do it as soon as you possibly can, so there's a bit of a disconnect there. So we've isolated part of the problem, but what's the solution? Just to reload the last save from somewhere that's not Ganon's castle? Well, in part, yeah. That alone would be a huge help, as the pinnacle fight of the game would be out of sight, out of mind, and motivate you to feel like that was final for long enough to get back into the game, which could change the perception of good ending or bad ending. But also, I think when a game is all about defeating evil and saving the world, the ideal would be some kind of epilogue scene or gameplay that takes place in a saved world. It doesn't have to be long and shouldn't be all of Hyrule, but something to feel like your work here is done. It's the bonfire from Return of the Jedi. It's Bilbo riding off in a boat into the sunset after the ring has been drowned in lava. It's closure. But that's what I think. What do you think? What are you most excited to see in Breath of the Wild 2? Let me know all that and more in the comment section down below, and we'll pull some of those comments and talk about them on our podcast this Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern time on the channel youtube.com/directly2you. And while you're down there, go ahead and hit the subscribe button like I said before and like the video. And subscribe to fanatixfour for more content like this every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern time. And that's about it for me. See y'all next time.